If you teach people to manage their system differently, you can reverse the age-related decline and give people back the energy levels they had 10 years ago.
So my guest today is Dr. Alan Watkins. Dr. Watkins has been a practicing medical doctor, cardiologist, neuroscientist, author of 10 books, founder of Complete Coherence, coach to CEOs, done 2 TED Talks, general all-round polymath. But in between all that, he does fit in time to be a highly entertaining speaker. Also one of the world's sort of foremost experts on coherence and coherent breathing and the effects on the body. And if you're a fan of this channel, you know that that's kind of my obsession. And in this discussion, he talks about heart rate variability and how by regulating our breathing, we can massively increase our heart rate variability. But it's about more than that, because when we begin to regulate our physiology internally, we actually begin to regulate our emotions as well, or we have much more of a handle on that. And then we can regulate our cognition. And before you know it, we're regulating our behavior, making better choices, and our lives become coherent. So yeah, really interesting guy, really interesting discussion, and I really hope you enjoy this video. Alan, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a real pleasure to have you on the channel.
Nice to see you, Tom.
I was hoping to ask you about heart rate variability. As a cardiologist and a neuroscientist, I'm really interested in your knowledge about that. So, I mean, what is heart rate variability? And as a doctor, what can you tell about me if you have that data?
So, many people don't realize that our heartbeat is never at the same rate twice in the space of a minute. It varies from roughly 60 beats per minute to maybe 85, 90 beats per minute, even when we're sitting in a chair. And so this has been known for centuries, frankly, but the medical profession got very interested in sort of mid-60s, really, because we discovered that if you watch the variation in heart rate of a baby when a mum's in labour, you can predict mortality. So since 1965, we've known that when babies lose the variability, they're in distress. So if you see a loss of this bouncing up and down of the baby's heart rate, you have to take a fetal scalp pH reading, and if that's acidotic, then emergency cesarean. So even to this day, anybody that has a baby in hospital, they often track the heart rate variability. And so that's 1965. 1975, an Australian physician noticed that there were some people who had heart attacks, and when he was watching them on the ward, some of the patients had variability and some of them didn't. So if you watch the monitor of a patient's bed, the patients where it was 75, 75, 75, 75, like metronomic, and then other patients, it would jump around 68, 75, 53, 59, 47, 52, 82. And the ones who had the variability made it off the ward, and the ones who had the metronomic heart died on the ward. So that was written up in 1975. So that kicked off a huge amount of interest amongst cardiologists, looking at using heart rate variability to predict mortality after a heart attack. And then in 1995, somebody actually had a look at the general population. Could you look at heart rate variability in the general population? What would that tell you? And we discovered that actually a loss of variability in the general population predicted something called all-cause mortality. So death from anything, even accidents, which I can explain. So the medical profession got very, very interested, but it still largely remained this sort of interest in heart rate variability. Probably about 30 to 40,000 scientific papers in the literature, a lot of them about the use of heart rate variability to predict mortality, but also more recently, morbidity, so illness, as well as risk of death. And it's sort of booming, in terms, because it's such easy data to acquire. You could just wear a heart monitor and you track and capture the data, and even some of the watches and chest straps, polar chest straps now pick up this data. So there's a huge amount of interest in not only looking at it in terms of mortality and illness and recovery from illness or risk of getting ill, but also in the general population as it underpins performance. So it's now quite widely used in sport, And we've been tracking heart rate variability in business for about 25 years. And it is really incredible what the kind of information you can extract about a human being just by looking at their variability.
What kind of things do you find in business? Is it that businesses where the employees have high heart rate variability do better?
Well, you can, first of all, you can stratify risk in business. So if you want to know, who's going to get ill, that's quite important information in terms of succession planning. So when business are going, oh, well, we'll appoint that person as the next CEO, or she might be the next people director or whatever. When you measure their variability, you can quantify their health risk. So that's quite useful in business. You can also use it to quantify how much energy people have got. So most people are pretty poor at assessing how much, and oh yeah, I'm full of beans, me, or oh, I'm absolutely exhausted. People's subjective assessment of their own energy levels is actually pretty poor. You can use heart rate variability to quantify how much energy have you actually got. Not how much do you think you've got, how much have you actually got? An HRV will quantify that, but most interestingly, it also underpins a whole variety of different things to do with their cognitive function and their general performance. So before we coach CEOs or C-suite leaders, we'll often measure their variability for somewhere between 24 and 72 hours. So as they wander around at work, we'll just pick up their data. And it gets pretty spooky. I mean, I remember a CEO who was a CEO of a large credit card company a couple of years ago. And I was looking at heart rate variability, and I said, look, just before we start coaching, I was just curious, how's your history A-level going? And it completely spooked her, right? And she goes, how do you know I'm doing a history A-level? I said, but you are, aren't you? She went, well, yeah, I am, but how do you know that? I said, oh, I can see it in your biology, right? You can't, you cannot see that in my biology. I said, I can. She said, how can you, no, I don't believe you. I said, well, look, one of the things we can extract from with some clever mathematics is we can see fluctuations in your adrenaline levels. Basically adrenaline levels should be high during the day and then lower in the afternoon and very low at night. But you, in your trace, those first 2 hours of sleep, you have this enormous adrenaline surge. It's like your head touches the pillow and you immediately start burning fuel, and it happens in those first 2 hours. And that's what we call a retrospective pattern. Your head touches the pillow, you start to review everything that happened to you that day and burn fuel doing it. Now, you're a woman of 52 with no children, so a woman of 52 with no children will have a bit of time on her hands. You're a very bright woman with time on her hands. You could be doing an exam, and given this retrospective pattern, it's going to be a history exam. It was a simple deduction.
Whoa, that is seriously impressive.
So that completely spooked her, and I said, look, you've asked us to come and help with your leadership, and I bet you, when you have your board meeting, you spend at least an hour before the board meeting going through, last month's minutes. She goes, have you been talking to my PA? I said, no, it's the same pattern. You lead by looking backwards, and the reason the company's struggling is every time you meet with the board, you keep telling them about last year and what you want to move away from, but what you're not articulating clearly enough is what do you want to move towards. It's because you keep looking backwards. It's like driving the car by looking in the mirror. You're not looking forward and you're not explaining forward, you're explaining backwards. So what was most interesting about all of that, Tom, is that when I coached her to articulate the future better, and we measured her biology 6 months later, the pattern had disappeared. Mm-hmm. So we could objectively prove to her that we'd fixed the problem.
That's incredible. So it's almost like, it's not just a measure of health. In the right hands, it's almost like a psychological x-ray or something.
Well, it is. It's quite spooky, and it literally renders lots of people dumbstruck, and they just can't believe. And we've got 25 years of looking at these patterns, and so you can extract all sorts of information about quality of sleep. You can extract information, as I said, about adrenaline levels, about recuperation. I remember coaching an ex-England soccer centre forward, since retired. And I was saying, and he was sort of, arguing about what, his life and all that. And I said, look, the issue is you're like a Terminator. Once you've decided to do something, you like lock on and you never let go. I said, your main problem is you can't get your backside off the couch. And of course, that was completely true. And I could see that in his data. So it's really pattern recognition, Tom, is that once you've seen thousands and thousands of these traces and talk to people about what's going on in their life, you start to figure out how the biology bleeds into the psychology, bleeds into the performance, bleeds into their life. And so you just trace it backwards. So it's a really interesting window on what's really happening for a human being. And what's great about it is it's not really subjective. I mean, there's the data. I mean, I'll give you one other story. I was coaching a few years ago a very famous CEO of a very big, well-known retailer. You know, and he was pretty good, but he had this incredible self-belief. So, you know, for the first 10 minutes in his office, he gave me 10 minutes about what a genius he was, which was quite entertaining to listen to. So he was bigging himself up massively, like he was talking to some investor. But I'd already got his biology, like we recorded his biology at work for a day. So I said, well, let's just assume that you are God's gift to retail. I'm not even going to argue with you on that. I said, if you're such a genius, I've only really got one question. And he said, well, what's that? I said, if you're such a genius, answer me this. Why is your data so bad? I said, you're at the third centile. So compared to our database, 97% of every executive I've ever measured has got better data than you. So if you're such a genius, why is that? And he was completely dumbstruck. You just couldn't answer it. So what it did, Tom, is it opened up a conversation to what was really going on, rather than his sort of marketing spin about himself. Mm-hmm. So we just cut straight to the chase of what was really happening in his life. And then over time, what we've seen is we can improve a leader's data by, on average, the results we get is about a 25% improvement in 6 months, which is effectively getting 10 years younger in 6 months.
Of their heart rate variability?
Of their heart rate. Your heart rate variability decays by about 3% per annum. So most people, you sort of peak in your early 20s, and then you have roughly a 3% per annum decline. I mean, some people who go through accelerated aging will decline faster, and so if you do nothing, you on average lose 3% per annum. But what we've seen is if you teach people to manage their system differently, you can reverse the age-related decline and give people back the energy levels they had 10 years ago, which is really important in business, because particularly through pandemics and market changes, leaders need lots and lots of energy. So teaching them to be much more effective in their energy management, and then being able to quantify that objectively. So rather than them saying, oh, I feel more energetic, or us saying to them, oh, you look more energetic, forget all that subjectivity. We can prove it to you. We can quant that for you and show you exactly how much energy you've regained or not.
So big question, how do you take someone with that level of heart rate variability up by that 20%?
Yeah, 20 to 30% on average. That's not the course record, by the way. The course record is 160%, is our current course record on one exec.
Did they regress into a baby at that point?
He started wearing nappies and chewing on a dummy. No, basically, what we're doing is we're teaching people to regulate their biology. That's something called interoception. So become more aware of their biology, what's happening in their biology, and control that through breathing techniques, which we'll probably come on to. And also learn to regulate their emotional state. And most people are very poor at that. And so if you don't regulate your emotions very well, you lose energy very easily throughout the day. So we teach them how to control their breathing and how to control their emotional state, plus a whole bunch of other stuff.
I know you're going to tell me a little bit about coherent breathing. So how do you train people in that sense to use breathing to change their heart rate variability?
Well, usually we just show them, first of all. So if I'm out, I'll tell you a little story just to sort of bring this alive, because sometimes when your biology is chaotic, and it usually becomes more chaotic, so the more threatened you feel, the more worried or panicky or anxious you feel, the more chaotic your biology becomes, and it shuts down your frontal cortex. So this is why children go blank in an exam. This is why people get stage fright. We have game shows that exploit this phenomena, because when people lose their frontal cortex, they blurt out silly answers, and it's quite entertaining in the context of a game show. But it's basically a survival mechanism. It goes back a couple 100,000 years. So when human beings were wandering across the prairie and a bear would come out from behind the rock. You don't need smart thinking. In fact, if you're stood there trying to be clever, the bear will eat you. So if you're stood there going, oh, does that bear look interested in me? Is that the brown bear or the grey bear? They'll eat you.
Yeah.
So we developed this mechanism in our biology, turn your biology into chaos, which means the heart rate variability becomes super chaotic. So the signal from the heart to the brain shuts down the frontal cortex and you effectively have a DIY lobotomy. So all human beings are at risk of a DIY lobotomy, and most people in business have experienced, in fact, most human beings have experienced this. You know, that's why you can't think of a smart thing you'd wished you'd said in the middle of the argument, you know, because you've gone blank. You know, so this is a fairly common phenomena, but 200,000 years ago, it would save your life. But today, your biology, you know, still goes into chaos, but we're not meeting bear, we're meeting each other. And so people can flick the switch on somebody else, their brain shuts down, and suddenly it's like they've taken the stupid pills. So what we're sort of essentially teaching people how to do is, first of all, be aware of that biology. So because sometimes when you're trying to explain it to somebody, they've got no frontal cortex. So even if you're the best teacher in the world, the explanation's not going in. So let me give you a little story just to illustrate this point. So when my wife and I set up the business a few years ago, the first 3 years we did pro bono work for 12 schools in Southampton, near where we live. We just poured all the profit into some free work in schools. And the very first school we went to visit, and we were meeting with all the teachers there, and halfway through that first meeting, there was at the door, and a teacher would come in to try and get the head to come and deal with this kid who was having a fight in his classroom and he couldn't stop him. So I call this kid Dylan. It's not his real name, but Dylan, right? So, and the teacher said, oh, head, you know, you've got to come out and sort Dylan out. And the head went, no, you sort him out, I'm in a meeting. The teacher went, no, head, it needs you to sort him out. I can't stop it. And they went, no, I'm in a meeting. No, go away, I'm in a meeting. You know, there was a sort of Mexican standoff for about 10 seconds. And then the teacher wasn't leaving, so the head clearly thought, oh, that's just sweet. They sort of apologized and left. And then being very smart, like many teachers are, what he did is he got hold of this kid who was 8 years old, and he frog marched him back to the staff room where I was meeting with the head and the senior leadership team. And he brought him into this little 8-year-old into the room, and he said, yeah, Watkins, you're clever, you fix him. And he shoves this kid at me, right? And this little crash comes in with his fists clenched like that. And he comes in and he sits down, you know, like that. And I said, oh, well, hi, Dylan, you know, we're having a meeting. So just sit there. I'm just talking, we'll come to you in a moment. Just sit there for a moment, if you don't mind. And I was saying, look, actually what happens is when people feel threatened, a bit like Dylan's just been threatened, biology goes into chaos, frontal lobe shuts down, no point in trying to reason with people at that point. But what you can do is show them their own biology. In fact, I tell you what, Dylan, I'll do this with you. And I put this clip on his earlobe. And he goes, oh, what's this? I said, well, look at that screen there. And sure enough, I was looking at his heart rate and his heart rate variability, and it was complete chaos. And I said, that's what happens when people are feeling threatened. Their biology goes into chaos. But if you click on this button here, you can see this breath pacer. So what you do really, when that goes up, breathe in. When that goes down, breathe out. When that goes up, breathe in. When that goes down, breathe out. So you just follow that. I'm going to talk to these people here. And I'm watching out the corner of my eye, and he's like, oh, what's all this? Ooh, I got on my ear. What's that on the screen? And sure enough, he starts watching this, going, what's that? Oh, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in. You know, and he starts following it, right? And I'm chatting to them, watching the corner out of my eye, and sure enough, in literally about 10 or 15 seconds, that signal goes into a sine wave, which is what we call coherent. So the heart rate variability signal, the amount of variability was about the same, but it went from an earthquake pattern to a pure S-shaped sine wave. And as soon as I saw that, I went, my goodness, Dylan. I said, wow. I said, you must have done this before. I haven't done it before, he says. I said, I've never seen somebody change their biology that quick. Head, did you know Dylan's a genius? He's controlled his biology in about 20 seconds. That's amazing, Dylan. I have never seen it. You've got a genius at the school. Head, you've got a genius at the school. And then the other teachers started to twig what I was up to. You see, I was lavishing this kid with praise. And I went, oh, maybe we could announce this in assembly, one of the teachers said. Oh, we should give him a certificate. Another one says, oh, with a gold star. And then suddenly they start lavishing with praise. And suddenly this kid starts to fluff right up. So here's an 8-year-old kid who, he's nobody no mates, basically. None of his classmates like him. He's the youngest of 5 kids. His dad's in prison. His life's a mess, basically. The teacher thinks he's disruptive. There is nothing in his life that's working, and he can control nothing about his life. But that morning, in 5 minutes, he learns, actually, there is one thing I can control in my life. And it turns out it's me. And he learned that in 5 minutes. So we showed him how to do that. Rather than giving him some long tech lecture, we showed him his biology. He saw what happened. We put the clip on, pressed the breath pacer. He started to follow it, and his biology changed. And he went out that staff room 10 foot tall. And within half an hour, that story had gone across the whole of the city, and we had 12 schools sign up.
Wow. So if kids can do it, then there's no excuse for the rest of us.
You can teach this. I mean, I've taught my 4 boys, when they were 3 years old. So you can start to teach people how to regulate their own system from a very early age. In fact, you can teach it to children before they've even acquired language. So you can teach children emotional regulation pre-verbal. So, for example, I've got this little thing here on my desk to illustrate the points. This little troll doll here, right? So with a baby, you can hug a troll doll to your heart and go, oh, and then pass the doll across to the baby. And so what that non-verbally transmits to the child is you can imbue something with love and transfer the love. No words. So what you're essentially doing is teaching the transferability of a positive emotion. Right? I mean, emotions are contagious. So you can start to teach this we've taught 3-year-olds up to 80-year-olds. So there isn't any age limit to being able to show people how to control their biology and to control their emotional state.
Wow.
And that's how you wind the clock back.
When you do that with the baby, does that calm the baby down? Is that
Yeah, very much so. And one of my 4 boys is profoundly autistic. So I don't know whether you know much about autism, but they get spooked by things all the time because the world's a very scary place because they make different interpretations about reality and all the data streams that we're swimming in. And so they're very easily spooked by, it could be the light through a window or the sound or the touch of a piece of cloth or clothing. And so we taught Sam to regulate his breathing. So, just by showing him, just following, and he could settle in much quicker. And we've also seen that very much when we were doing the schools work. It was amazing. You'd see kids come in from the lunch break all amped up, and then they would go, and there usually in most classrooms, there would be a laptop set up with the ear clip, and the kids would just clip themselves in for 2 or 3 minutes, get themselves into a coherent state, and then go to their desk. So they would literally prepare themselves for learning for the afternoon. So the teacher would come in and wouldn't have to spend 10 minutes, shut up, sit down, quiet. That didn't happen. The kids were self-regulating. In fact, it was really interesting doing the schools work, is the kids learned these skills way faster than the teachers. The teachers were the hard people. Trying to get the teachers to do it was more of a struggle than trying to get the kids to do it. The kids picked it up like that.
Was there a measurable effect on grades? Was that part of it?
Academic performance improved. So in English and maths, that went up. Behavioural disruption went down. There was much less behavioural outbursts. The number of exclusions when kids get sort of sent home and don't come back to school for a week, it's called exclusion. That went down. Teacher stress levels went down massively. And it all was driven by teaching human beings, whether it's the children or the adults in the school, how to get control of their own system. Because most human beings have never learned that. I mean, one of the reasons we work with 90 multinationals all over the world, all sectors, all geographies, all markets. And we're teaching, men and women in their sort of 50s and 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, frankly, stuff they should have learned when they were 8. And this is not taught properly in schools. So you're having to teach, it's sort of slightly embarrassing, you have to teach a 55-year-old how to regulate their own emotion. because most human beings just aren't taught this stuff, but it's incredible what you can do once you've got those things under control, and it can super enhance brain function. So in business where we work, the effectiveness of any business is ultimately driven by the quality of the decisions leaders make, and those quality of the decisions based on the quality of their thinking. So what drives the quality of thinking? Well, the quality of thinking in a human mind is largely determined by our emotional state. So if you want to think better thoughts, if you want to outthink the competition, how do you do that? I mean, there's that lovely Einstein quote is, you can't solve the problems with the same level of thinking that created the problems. You need a new level of thinking. All right, Einstein, how do we have a new level of thinking? Well, you can't think your way into new thinking, but what you can do is regulate your emotions much more effectively, and then unlocks new cognitive capabilities. And so that's often the start of the journey when we take individual leaders and teams on, is show them how to do that. I mean, there's lots and lots more we teach them, but often that's a key sort of foundational piece to get people to get much more effective through coherent breathing and emotional regulation, emotional literacy, and all those types of skills. And it unlocks a whole new level of capability in terms of their consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I had highlighted in your book, Coherence, was how you mentioned how emotions and consciousness evolved together. And it's something you just simply don't really think about. That really struck me.
Well, most people aren't students of themselves, rather bizarrely. I mean, so again, when you look at business leaders, or frankly, anybody running anything complicated, government, the United Nations, most people are what we call it addicted. They're focused on doing things. Not surprisingly, that's what they get hired for, that's what they get fired for, but they become addicted to doing. And I said, well, okay, so if you think there's a problem out there in the world of objective, rational world of doing, you mistakenly assume that the answer's also out there. But contemplate this. If I show you as a neuroscientist how to treble the speed of your mind and treble the quality of your consciousness, do you think it'll improve your ability to do stuff? They go, well, yeah, make a massive difference. I said, all right, well, when was the last time you had a meeting with yourself? What do you mean? So when was the last time you had a meeting with yourself to figure out how to treble the speed and treble the quality? Well, I don't have meetings with myself. Why not? Too busy doing things. There's your problem, right? Is we're on this sort of hamster wheel as we see every problem as an it problem, a task, a target, a goal or metric, something we've got to do. But often the game changer resides within us. So if you treble the speed of your mind and treble the quality of your mind, suddenly it becomes crystal clear that there's a completely different way of approaching this that's much more effective than anybody else is engaged in. And that's what will give you the competitive advantage. But that only occurs to you is if you're curious about yourself and your own capability and what you're truly capable of, and how many other levels of capability reside within you waiting to be unlocked. And most human beings aren't even curious about that. They're too busy focused on their spreadsheets, their email, their strategy documents, all the stuff out there. And they're not that curious about what goes on in here. In fact, a lot of people have lost touch with what goes on in here. So they've lost touch with their humanity a lot of times. And so what we're trying to do is to reintroduce them. But I mean, all the signs are there, Tom. I mean, if you look at I often remind people, if you look at the great leadership speeches in history, and there are books on this, of course, and we ask when we all go around the world, what's the greatest leadership speech in history? What do you think comes top? Of any leader, alive or dead, in the last 100 years?
Probably Martin Luther King.
There you go. And you know what? People in China say that too. So all over the world, the dream speech, Martin Luther King, comes top of the list. Now, if you analyze Martin Luther King's dream speech, he says, I have a dream. He doesn't say, Tom, you've got a dream. And he doesn't say, there is a dream. He says, I have a dream. So he starts with I. He starts with the inside of himself. That is the start point of leadership. And rather ironically, most leaders are focused on it, the task, the objective thing out there. They're not focused on I, but look at what Martin Luther King, I have a dream. right? It starts with I. If you look at the lesson of Nelson Mandela, so when you do a poll of, okay, that was the best speech of all time, who's the most influential leader of all time, often Mandela comes top of that list. Again, all over the world, right? And you go, well, look at Mandela's life. For 26 years, he was locked on Robben Island. He couldn't do anything. There was no doing. Didn't have many people to relate to. The relating wasn't great, and a couple of rather dull guards and a couple of inmates. He spent 26 years cultivating his interior, his I. So when he was finally released, such was the magnificence of his spirit, he had an amazing effect in the last half of his life. And that's not by chance. He cultivated the inside of himself. So if you look at the lesson of Martin Luther King and you look at the lesson of Nelson Mandela, it's the same thing. So if we can help people become a bit more curious about, well, how do I regulate my breathing? How do I move beyond breath control to regulate my emotional state? How do I step change my maturity, my sophistication, the quality of my consciousness? That's where the game is. And as you said yourself, our emotional state, our consciousness and our identity evolve together and collapse together. So if you even look in the way that people speak about themselves, you might find you've had a bad day and you say to somebody the following day, sorry, Tom, I wasn't myself yesterday. I was a bit irritable and grumpy and grouchy. And when people say that, it's usually they're in a negative emotional state, right? So who I was shrunk. I became less of me, right? So my emotion was negative. I wasn't thinking clearly. And I was the shrunken version of me, because these things expand and contract together. And there'll be other days where the most loving version of Tom shows up, the most expansive version of Tom shows up. With much clearer thinking, I had much bigger thoughts. So just as our consciousness contracts with negative emotion, our identity contracts with negative emotion, it also goes the other way, is that when we're being the biggest version of ourselves, our thoughts and our consciousness expands, our sense of identity becomes larger, and we're in a much more positive emotional state. And it's because these things in human evolution, they evolve together, and therefore they expand and they contract together.
Yeah, I mean that's what I love about your book is the sort of these almost Russian dolls of, if you can regulate the breathing, you can regulate the physiology, you can regulate the emotions, cognitive regulation, behavioral as a result, social as a result, influence as a result. It's just such a perfect philosophy. Rightly, your business is called Complete Coherence, and I think that it's absolutely perfect, that naming for it.
Well, if I might, it's a description of reality. So I don't even think of it as a philosophy in terms of a load of theoretical stuff. I mean, I'm a scientist, right? So I base it on observation. I observe myself, I observe relationships, I observe what's happening in the world. So it's not a theoretical model. All human beings have an interior. I mean, it's there. As I'm talking to you now, you're having thoughts about what I'm saying. As you're asking me questions, I'm having thoughts about what you're saying. So that's your I and my I. So as we're talking to each other, we're getting on. So that's our we, that's our relationship. That's happening now. We are relating to each other while we're doing this podcast. So in every moment of our life, there is I, there is we, and there is it. There are these three dimensions to our life in every moment of our life. This isn't a theory or a model or a framework or a philosophy. It's a description of reality. All human beings are multidimensional. And the mistake that leaders make is they collapse and they become one-dimensional in a three-dimensional world, which is why we struggle to solve problems, is we see the problems one-dimensionally when they're really three-dimensional. So if we don't take a three-dimensional approach, right, we don't ever solve these problems, which is, I mean, one of the great ironies, I started writing a series of books called Wicked and Wise, because I was sat on the couch a few years ago, as I see many people will have had this thought, watching another story about the NHS, what's right and wrong with the NHS, I thought, my goodness, I've literally heard this identical news item probably on a monthly, if not a weekly basis for the last 25 years. Isn't that interesting? In a world that's accelerating, getting more complicated and faster, in this sort of hockey stick world where everything's changing, there are some things that never seem to change, like this problem with the NHS. That never seems to get, I mean, I've heard this story for 25 years. So there's an interesting paradox. In a world where everything's changing, some things never change. Now, why is that? It's because we're taking a one-dimensional approach to a three-dimensional problem. And when you do that, you simply do not improve the situation, which is why we're still wrestling with immigration, we're still wrestling with poverty, we're still wrestling with climate change, affordable healthcare. And there are many of these wicked problems. And one of the reasons they seem intractable is they're not really intractable, but we take a one-dimensional approach to a three-dimensional problem, which makes them intractable. The truth is, if we took a three-dimensional approach to them, we would start solving some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, especially to hear your scientific approach, because I'm from a philosophy background, so I studied philosophy many, many years ago, but it's very similar to an idea in philosophy where we can have two truths where two truths are perfectly true, but one's subjective and one's objective, and together they create a paradox. So it's quite a similar sort of thing.
Oh, well, that's very interesting, because one of the 4 books I've got out this year is all about the nature of truth. And we talk about 3 truths. So there's the subjective truth, there's the objective truth, and then there's the shared cultural truth. Right? So, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Actually, there are 3 truths. And the mistake or the problems we get into is when we mistake my subjective truth for the absolute truth. And that's why people start falling into arguments, is I think that my view of the world is absolutely true for all human beings. And of course, that's not the case. So it's a really quite a complicated thing, understanding what the truth really is. And we live, as you know, in a post-truth world. So humanity has evolved to a level in terms of its cultural shared truth, if you will, and created this world where, full of fake news and, particularly fueled by social media platforms, in what's called a post-truth. Post-truth was the Oxford English Dictionary word of the year in 2016. So we live in this sort of, and one of the 4 books I've got, is how do we reclaim the truth? Because we've lost sight of that.
So I hope you enjoyed hearing what Dr. Watkins had to say. If you enjoyed this video, I have done another video with Dr. Watkins where we talk about how he helped the Dalai Lama's team when they were studying the neuroscience of meditation, and also how he helped Team GB go on to win 6 medals in the 2012 Olympics, and I think a few more in the 2016 Olympics, using breathwork, using emotional self-regulation techniques. And in that video, he talks about how accessible these are and how even children can do them. So I'll leave a link to that somewhere around here. And if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel if you're interested in videos with experts in meditation, breathwork, creativity, art, and yoga.